Welcome. It is 4/2 of 2015. We're going to continue with Robert Jenson. We're going to take a look at his doctrine of Phronesis. Phronesis is the Greek term for intentionality, and it really has, like all Greek terms, it has a lot more content to it. It actually means to form your intention around observation, spiritual judgment, a marking out of goals, and then performing that action. So it's like a four-step intentionality. But it's the Greek concept of Phronesis. And we're going to look at Jenson's view on it because he ties it in with creation and the individual's self-identity. So it could be called his doctrine of self-identity as well. It's kind of a look at, it's kind of tied in with Hegel's concept of the ethics of recognition. The first moment is going to be the transcendental focus of Phronesis. He says that we must begin with the concept of personhood. Phronesis includes the concept of personhood, and we need to understand that God's free personhood is at the ground of his nature. Free personhood of the triune converse as the ground of divinity opens itself up to creation and to humanity. He adopts the Thomas Aquinas principle that essence and existence are distinguished in humanity, but essence and existence are not distinguished in divinity. That's why we can say that the free personhood of the divine is actually the ground of the nature of the divine. So you can say that if you adopt the Aquinas principle. Now the term apperception is borrowed from Kant, and it talks about that transcendental consciousness. He's got 10 aspects. Personal consciousness is precisely transcendental. Our consciousness includes a phronetic focused perspective at that dialogue threshold. God always possesses a phronetic intentionality as well. The triune personhood constitutes a phronetic intent, and the triune personhood constitutes three divine perspectives. Now, our phronetic stance constitutes our epistemology, our epistemic attitude. And like I said, he does bring up self-identification here. Self-definition becomes a reflexive identification within the subjectivity that develops within this phronetic stance. God is the divine principle of our phronetic stance. We focus our phronesis by the occasion of being taken up in the triune dramatic location, and therefore accommodation creates our phronetic stance, that accommodation of the divine opening up, that internal swelling or that internal expansion makes room for us. We are taken up into the tri-mutual space of the ousia space, and that is where we discover our content and our structure for forming our phronetic stance of intention, by being taken up into the divine expanding distension. And we frame up this interpretive filter of a phronetic stance as a framed narrative unity. So it's going to be a framed narrative unity that we consolidate into a singular framed up interpretive position, or phronesis. Now the element of contingency must be discussed. He's got 8 aspects. We never face the world as raw data. It always has a prior communal interpretation, and our phronetic focus therefore is always qualified by the historical, and it gives it that element of contingency. We're tensioned between the ideal divine triune history within that tri-mutual space that we've been gathered up within, and but we're also up against an actual human community that is historical. We focus our phronetic stance on the Son of the Father, because the Son is the voice of the Father, and on the benefit of the realm of spirit. Therefore, our phronetic focus demands continually being involved in the acknowledgement of the Son. To slip away from that might cause us to miss our mark, which is hamartia. Remember, the sin of hamartia is missing the mark. Well, our intentionality, our phronetic stance, if not continually focused on the Christ event, could slip out of its intended mark. And we are tension between two generic concepts in our Phronesis, the concept of coherence, that triune coherence of content in the tri-mutual ousia space within the Father, and justice, which is the narrative form which is given to our historical actuality that we face. That is, the ideal within actuality is to reach a democratic justice. Even though we're not there, we're at an intermediate state, but that is our goal. And so we do end up with our own Christian phronetic stance of intentionality. And in the Christian perspective, that means to observe, to evaluate and judge spiritually, and to mark out very specific intentionality goals, and then to enter into praxis action. So it's observe, judge, mark out, and praxis. Observe, judge, mark out, and praxis. That's the transcendental focus, kind of the ideal side of things. But what's interesting here is that Jenson says we're going to go from self-consciousness to ego, whereas every postmodern that we study, you begin with the intuitive ego, and then you grow into self-consciousness. From the Christian theological perspective, Jenson says we begin with self-consciousness, and only then can we shape our ego. So the ego shaping is the second moment. The self has the phronetic stance of four aspects. We do have a descriptive content, which is deferred initially as far as defining the ego. The ego is something within our field of consciousness, which we are involved in with our phronetic stance at the dialogue threshold, and our self-recognition is gathered in the return from the community within which we are located and within which we gather at the dialogue threshold, the Dekunta threshold. So we are seeking and defining a communally based ego identity. Ego and self-recognition are acquired from the face value of referential language that evolves at that threshold of dialogue. Initially, within this phronetic stance, ego exists simply in a state of structure of deferral. We don't have that automatic absolute knowledge of how to proceed. We're going to grow in our knowledge, and we're going to grow in our filling of that deferred space of self-identity. It's not immediate. 7 moments of the structure of deferral. We begin with intuition, but it's an intuition that we are going to abandon. The will of the self is driven from its occupation with immediate sensate experience. We take up the explicitly willed action of passing through a mediation. So we're going to transition from unmediated objective expansion to a continually mediated action, which is mediated through the Christ event for Christians. We do reach an interrogation, a self-interrogation, within this mediation because we realize we don't fully understand the Christ event, not all the content that it holds, and we know that we do not fully correspond to it either. So we have kind of a self-contradictory awareness at the dialogue threshold that we're not really equal to our task. We realize that of ourselves, we're not really equal to the fullness of the aspiration which we desire. So there is this moment of the annihilation of the sensate self-will, and internally positing more of a servant-type mortifying will, a servitude-type mortifying will. That allows us to reach kind of an enjoined consciousness of our phronetic stance, which is informed by the Christ event, coupled with that consciousness of the obvious conflict which we face externally and the conflict we face internally. Now, Jenson does want to point out that the postmodern era has really blown it on working out Phronesis. The only person I can think of as a postmodern who wrote about Phronesis was John Milbank. That's the only person I'm really aware of that did that. He did write, but he wrote a social postmodern position. And he did at least address Phronesis. Now our third moment is going to be to move beyond. We know what our ideal is in the first moment. We know the failure of the postmodern movement and the frustration there of trying to fill this deferred space of self-identity. The third moment is freedom and the return of recognition within this process of phronesis and dialogue at the Dekunta threshold, or the dialogue threshold within community. The postmodern position resulted in a disintegration of personal narrative. The self can only grasp a succession of pulses of consciousness. But if we say that our answer is going to be Christian theology, in other words, the work that Robert Jenson is doing here, his 2 volumes of Christian theology are attempts to work on self-definition and to work on forming an authentic phronetic stance. Now, the Christian theology does offer something outside and objective that does grant and guarantee the possibility of a focused consciousness. It becomes equal to the coherence of the tri-mutual life of God and that tri-mutual ousia space. And we are related to it through the accommodation of the divine that internally expands, or distension means to swell within, but it's God opening up himself from within to include room for creation, to include room for the accommodation of grace through the voice and speech act of the Son. So we are lifted up into this tri-mutual space as an act of accommodation, and that's where we're going to form, we're going to find our content, we're going to find our form to form our phronetic intentionality. So as Christians, we do not simply face a plurality of social identities. We face one actual community, of a community constituted in the Christ event, in other words, the church. Jenson is extremely pro-ecclesiology. He centers everything in ecclesiology. The Christ event is apprehended as the Son, as the speech act, or the Father, and as the resting place of Spirit. So we acquire the self-reflexive moment of self-identity in the moment of return. The self is the self as seen and offered by the Christ event community. In other words, it's the Hegelian position of self-identity is acquired through the return of recognition. That which we posit and actualize in our phronetic stance of intentionality, where we observe, judge, mark out goals, and then proceed with our action of praxis, is going to offer up a return that we will gather up. It does include activity on the side of the self. We will gather up this return, and that which is affirmed and reinforced will be able to apply to self-definition, but we get that information through return. So it's a very excellent view of Phronesis. I've just seen so many scholars of late, especially in the postmodern movement, that do not even address Phronesis, and it is a key Christian category. But Jenson did not ignore it. He gave it a great attentiveness in 95 to 105, and that will wrap up our overview of Jenson's doctrine of Phronesis.